I made this weekend. Oh my God. It has a really, really, really nice sourdough smell. And you can do the same thing. Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. This is my video on sourdough starters, how to create and maintain one. So welcome. I'm gonna do a little intro on sourdough. If you wanna skip this entire part and just go to the beginning of how to make one, this is your time code. Skip ahead to that in this video.
And later in this video, I have a section on troubleshooting your starter and answering some of your questions from Instagram. If you want to skip to that part, this is your time code.
I'm a new sourdough baker myself. I started kind of with everybody when the quarantine happened, and then everybody was baking sourdough bread, so I was one of the ones that jumped on that bandwagon. And ever since then, I've been really, really, really into the art of sourdough, the art and science of sourdough. And I've been documenting my journey on Instagram, and a lot of you wanted kind of a how-to tutorial on how to make sourdough starters. This is my sourdough starter. Her name is Scarlett O'Hara. I actually used to have more than one sourdough starter. I always had Scarlett O'Hara, but I used to have one called Breadward Norton as the Incredible Bulk. I know. But sadly, Breadward is no longer with us because Evan accidentally killed him.
Before we go into making one, we have to answer the question, what even is a sourdough starter?
In the most basic of terms, sourdough starter is a homegrown yeast. We're not using any commercial store-bought yeast that comes in those little packages, and that yeast culture is what will rise your bread.
Yeast exists all around us. It's on the surface of foods, it's on our skin, and it's in the air. So when you mix flour and water together and let it sit for many days, it starts to collect yeast from the air and ferments until you have a live little culture. It can take anywhere from 2 weeks to up to 2 months to get a very mature starter.
But you should start seeing some activity within a few days of creating your first starter. That doesn't mean you can bake with it right away, but you will start to see some activity. Theoretically, as long as somebody is there, whether it's you, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, your great-great-great-great-grandkids, as long as somebody is feeding it regularly with the appropriate amount of flour and water, sourdough cultures will never die. They could live forever. Does anybody else think this is cool? Am I just a nerd? I think it's really cool. So I'm gonna take you through days 1 through 7, at which point after day 7, you should be able to just take the same process and run with it.
These are the basic items you need. A nice jar with height to allow room for the yeast to rise, a kitchen scale that weighs in grams, unbleached bread flour or unbleached all-purpose flour.
If you can find bread flour, it's preferable in this situation only because we need that higher protein count. Not every store has it. Sometimes it's a little harder to find bread flour, so if you can't find it and all you have is all-purpose, that's totally fine.
And filtered water. You can either buy filtered water or do what I do. Just leave out a cup of water on the counter overnight to let the chlorine evaporate.
So get the kitchen scale out, right on top of that, and zero it out. And the reason why we use the kitchen scale and do this in grams is because we're measuring everything by weight instead of volume, which is just a lot more precise. 25 grams of your bread flour or your all-purpose flour. And we're gonna put in an equal amount of water. So it's 25 grams of flour, 25 grams of water. So that makes this a 1-to-1 starter ratio. Now before I put the water in there, I'm just gonna warm it up a little bit, like 10-15 seconds in the microwave. The reason why you want your water a little bit warmer than room temperature, temperature is the activator for the yeast. So the warmer the water, the faster the fermentation will happen.
When you're mixing this all together, make sure to get every last bit of flour. There shouldn't be any dry flour. It should be completely incorporated.
And you'll come out with a consistency that's like pasty, and that's totally normal. So as the yeast cultures go through various stages of growth and development, they're actually going to smell really different. So from the start, I want you to familiarize yourself with how everything smells. Right now, since we just it's brand new, there's absolutely no yeast in this right now. It smells like raw flour.
Store it in the oven with the light on. The light creates just enough ambient heat to keep the starter warm and happy.
Day 1, day 2, and day 3 look exactly the same.
25 grams of flour, 25 grams of water, and no discarding yet.
Your sourdough starter is not going to look any different, and that's okay, totally normal. Take a smell. Its scent might have changed just a little bit, maybe a little bit more yeasty, but at this stage I would not expect to see anything very different happening with your starter.
By day 3, you should start to see some activity.
You will start to see some foamy bubbles happening on the surface. That's your first sign that like something's happening in there, some yeast is starting to collect and ferment. This is good.
So we're just going to keep adding to it with the same ratios as the last 2 days. 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of water, and make sure you're doing this part at the same time every day, so 24 hours apart.
A quick note about the smells and why it's really important to keep smelling your starter throughout the whole process. This is Scarlett O'Hara, who you've met earlier in the video. She smells like bread, like if you were to cut open a really delicious loaf of sourdough bread that was straight out of the oven. That's what she smells like. It's very mild, it's almost sweet. Whereas this starter, which is brand new, it's only a few days old and I actually created it for this video. It smells like cheese. The smelliest of smelly French cheeses. And that's simply because it's so new, its bacterial colony is totally different from Scarlett O'Hara. This is the quote-unquote bad bacteria, but that's normal. Eventually, the good bacteria that we want, the bread-making bacteria, will out-compete and win in this colony, and it will eventually, if I were to keep maintaining this, smell as good as Scarlett O'Hara. I'm gonna go to bed now. By day 4, now we have something happening. You will see a lot more activity on the surface, a lot more of those foamy bubbles on the top, and it may have risen just a little bit. So if you have a really strong starter on day 4, we're gonna change up the ratios and feed it a little differently starting on day 4. Some of you might need to give it another day, and so you will do that on day 5. And the way that you know that your starter is strong enough to move on to the next phase of this feeding schedule, you want to see a lot of fermentation activity in your starter, so lots of bubbles, not only on the surface, but on the inside. If you look on the side, like here's Scarlett O'Hara. If you look on the side of the jar, you see all those bubbles in there? So instead of just feeding it with the regular 1-to-1 ratio that we've been doing with the 25 and 25, we're gonna start to discard our sourdough. From this point on, we're not going to do the same thing that we've been doing the past few days. We were doing a 1-to-1 ratio before, which meant it was equal flour and equal water. But now, since we have a mature-ish culture of yeast, we're going to do a totally new ratio. It's 1 to 2 to 2.
So essentially, this means your mother starter to flour to water.
Let me plug in some numbers so that makes sense. 20 grams of mother starter, and since we're doing 2 and 2, you just multiply that by 2. 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. If you all remember from math class, if you boil those numbers down, you come out with a base ratio of 1 to 2.
Bet you didn't think you'd be doing math in sourdough, huh? But it's really so simple. So given the 1-to-2 ratio, we're going to take 20 grams of the mother starter and weigh that into the new jar. Then add to that 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. Then back in the oven with the light on until tomorrow. Everything that's left from the mother starter in this jar gets thrown away. I'll explain why we do this in the Q&A at the end of the video.
As you get more advanced, there are other ratios down the line that we can play with and that you probably will have to pull in at some point, but in this very early stage, all you need to know or worry about is that 1-to-2 ratio.
So this is me changing and feeding Scarlett O'Hara at 9 a.m. And same thing as before, it's 20 grams of mother starter mixed with 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. When I'm done, I mark the starting point on the jar, then put her in the oven with the light on. And I'll do this again at 9 p.m. the same night. And this is the same schedule you will follow from now until eternity.
A lot of online sources and some bakers online say that you can start to bake with your starter anywhere from like 7 to 10 days after creating it. While it's technically true, realistically, it's probably going to take longer than that. Rather than go by the number of days that it's been, I would say it's smarter to go by the characteristics of your starter to figure out if it's ready to bake with. So these are the things that you should be looking for to judge that. So the first thing, and probably the most important thing, is we should be looking for something called peak rise. Basically what that means is that around 8 to 12 hours after every single feeding, your starter is at least doubling in size, if not tripling in size. That's preferable. That's the reason why we put the mark on the jar, so that we can see exactly how much the starter has risen each time you feed it. Second, your starter should start to really mellow out in smell. It should become very mild and nutty, and it should smell like bread. And finally, there are some physical cues that you should be looking for besides just the rise. So a healthy starter always has like a very complex strand and gas bubble structure.
Take a spoon and drag it through the starter. See those strands and gas bubbles? That's what you want to look for. It took my starter about 4 weeks to reach this point.
Once your starter has hit all of these points, then you know that it is ready to bake with. When making a starter, do you have to keep discarding half during every feed? Seems wasteful. When I started doing sourdough starters, I did not understand this concept. I was so confused as to why you would throw away what you just made. Every time you feed it, you're adding to the volume in the jar, and then it expands. It expands to almost 3 times its original size. So if you didn't discard and you just continually fed it, your sourdough starter would eventually triple and triple and triple and triple in size every single time you fed it. So in order to maintain like a manageable size of sourdough starter, you have to throw away a good majority of it every single time you feed it. The reason why we can discard the sourdough without losing it, like without killing it completely, because we're throwing away the majority of it, but we're not throwing away all of it. We're holding back a few grams of it. That 20 grams or 15 grams, even 2 grams, that is enough to keep your culture alive. There's 2 things you can do with your starter to make use of it so you're not actually throwing it away every time. Starter is great for compost. So if you have a compost pile, like we do, out in the back, you can throw that starter twice a day on your compost pile and your compost will be very happy with it. The other thing you can do is you can bake with starter discard, but there are a lot of bakers who provide recipes for that, and I would follow the recipe to a T, because you do have to make a lot of adjustments to account for the flour and the water that's in your starter when you put it into another recipe. So if you want to start with my recipe, you can click on that video up there. That'll kind of walk you through how to make English muffins with your sourdough discard, and they come out so delicious. I would highly recommend that one. If you don't see a lot of activity happening on day 4, like what I'm talking about with the bubbles and stuff like that, that's totally fine. That does not mean that you did anything wrong. It does not mean that there is no yeast or that it's dying or whatever. The frustrating thing about sourdough starters and just the sourdough process in general, everything is a factor, including where you live, your elevation, the moisture content in the air where you live, the temperature in your house, the temperature outside your house, the flour that you're using, where it was milled, where it was grown. All of this plays a part into your specific sourdough culture. So even though I'm telling you what's happening with my cultures, it's not exact, because you're using different flour than I'm using, and you're probably doing this in a different part of the country or maybe a different part of the world. And so your specific cultures are going to act a little bit differently than everybody else. So you just have to have patience. Please trust me. Love Donna J asked, how do you know when your starter has gone bad? So when starter dies, it's obvious because it will look dead. This is what dead starter looks like. How do we know it's dead? There is a layer of black liquid on the top, and that is all the dead yeast and bacteria. that is a very surefire sign that you have killed your starter. And if that happens to you, start over. This is weeks and weeks of neglect. Oh, I'm doing so much talking. I think thinking that you've killed your sourdough starter is like the most common troubleshooting situation, because sometimes in the beginning, your starter is not gonna act like everyone says it should, and it's not gonna be like overflowing from your jar like you always see on Instagram. Those can be misleading. Believe it or not, it's actually hard to kill sourdough starter. If you really, really, really neglect it and just never feed it again, it will die. But if you're underfeeding it or overfeeding it, or it's too cold, it won't die from those things. It'll just go into a dormant state. 9 times out of 10, your starter is probably not dead, it's just struggling. So if you're experiencing a struggling starter, there's a few things that you can manipulate to help your starter kind of pick up. First thing is to reduce the feedings back to once a day. So if you've kind of upgraded to that twice a day feeding and you're noticing that it's not really doing very much, or it was and now it's not, reduce it back down to 1 feeding a day. And that's basically just giving the yeast in the culture enough time to react to the food that you're giving it, and it will eventually pick up to where you can go back to twice a day. The other major factor of a struggling starter, and this was my problem as well, is temperature. Temperature is huge when it comes to not only the starter, but also the loaf process, like when you're actually making sourdough bread. So you can really control the activity level in your starter just by increasing the temperature a few degrees. And this is really common, especially if it's a cold day or if you live in a cold climate. The easiest way to like pep up your starter is just to put it somewhere that's a little bit warmer. And I'm not talking like hot, I mean like anywhere between 78 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Similarly, on the flip side, if you have a starter that's too active, maybe you live in a hot climate and you can't control its growth, it's out of control growth, you can slow it down by putting it in cold temperatures. A lot of bakers will put their starters in the fridge just to slow down fermentation. If they don't intend to use their starter for a little while, you can put it in the fridge. The cold temperature of the fridge really slows down fermentation. So again, you will get used to this balance as you do your starters more and more, but just keep in mind the basic rule that if it's struggling, increase the temperature. If it's too active, decrease the temperature. Is it normal to have a dry and smelly layer of flour on top of hooch on very warm days and not well-fed starters? Let me take a sip. Okay, so first of all, if you have hooch on the top layer of your sourdough starter, and hooch is basically if you have like a layer of liquid, that's an indicator that your starter is hungry and you need to feed it more. We want to avoid even seeing hooch to begin with. Number 2, if you have a layer of hooch and then something on top of the hooch, like a dry layer of flour, then that means you are starving your starter to death. If you suddenly develop hooch on your starter, it's okay. It does not mean you killed it by any means. It's still totally alive. It's just really hungry. So if you're having like a feeding schedule in the beginning and you're only feeding it once a day and you develop that layer of hooch, that's an indicator that you need to start feeding your starter twice a day. And if you're doing it twice a day and you're still getting a layer of hooch, then you need to start playing around with the ratios, and that takes us deeper into the math, which I will tackle in another video, but I don't want to confuse you in this early stage. All you need to know is if you have hooch developing on your starter, it is hungry and you need to feed it more. Ooh, this is a really good question and something that I was super confused about when I started. Okay, can I feed different types of flour to my starter? So this is both a yes and no answer. So yes, you can technically change the flour in your sourdough starter, but I wouldn't change it in this early stage. You can do it down the line, but for right now, don't change the flour. In fact, don't even change the brand. If you suddenly introduce a different type of flour before it really gets mature, you could shock it and actually hurt the fermentation process. Later, down the line, when your starter is much stronger and it's reliable and you know exactly how it's gonna behave, then you can actually start to change up your flours a little bit. Sometimes people add whole wheat flour and rye flour to their sourdough starters. Both of those are kind of like superchargers for your sourdough starter. They add like some more complex flavors to the starter. But you really can't do that until it's much, much, much stronger than now. Keisha Robinson asked, I bought a starter online. Is this cheating the baking process? It's not cheating. In fact, if you wanted to skip the whole beginning stages of this video and just jump to like maintaining a regular starter, you could just ask a sourdough baker to give you some of their discard. Because bakers like me, you know, this is later tonight, I'm gonna throw away more than half of Scarlett O'Hara. Rather than throwing it away, I could give it to a friend. But it would be Scarlett O'Hara. It wouldn't be like her own starter. It wouldn't be her own cultures that she grew. It would be my cultures that she's maintaining. I don't think it's cheating at all, but I will say I think you're cheating yourself of the experience. And really understanding how to make sourdough bread and sourdough starters comes from doing it yourself. Do starters with different types of flour have an impact on the final loaf flavor? I only have one with AP and whole wheat flour, wondering if I should try making a different starter. Technically, yeah. A starter that is all rye is going to taste different than an all-purpose starter. That said, you don't necessarily have to have many different strands of starter. There are techniques to change the flavor of sourdough, even with like one basic all-purpose starter. And that's it. So make sure you give your starter enough time to do this very reliable routine. Make sure it's rising and falling on time and it smells good, yada yada. If you have that happening for a few weeks, you can move on to make your first loaf of sourdough. I'm gonna make a video of my base recipe and I'll walk you through start to finish, just like this, how you make an actual loaf of sourdough. So that video will be linked below this one. Thank you guys so much for watching as always. And if you like this video and you like generally food and travel, please subscribe to my channel. I post lots of things like this, lots of recipes and how-to videos with food, and also things that are at the intersection of food and travel because by profession, I am a travel journalist. If you have any other questions about sourdough starters or just want to make comments, leave it on this video. Also go and find me on Instagram. I'm at the Travel Muse. I'm super active on Instagram and I try to answer everybody that writes to me. Good luck on your starters. I'll see you next time.